Hey everyone, do you want to know how to make Twitter codes like you see on your screen right now? Well, if so, stick around till the end of the video and I'll show you how. Okay, so to get started, I'm just going to quickly show you a couple of things I've already got done in my project before we can start even thinking about our Twitter codes. So first of all, in game settings, under security, I've enabled studio access to API services. This allows us to test data stores in within Studio. I've also created a leader stats script which contains cash and gems. If you would like to know how to make leader stats, you can find a video on it within our YouTube channel. I've also created a data store script which will save our cash and gems here as well. Once again, you can find a video on that linked with this video. Okay, so now let's get started. So the first thing we're going to want to do is create our GUI so we have some buttons to actually click. So under starter GUI, I'm going to add a screen GUI. And if you want to know a bit more about GUI in Roblox, we've got a series, which once again will be linked with this video. Now within this screen GUI, I'm going to actually first of all rename it to Codes UI or Codes GUI. I'm just going to call it Codes UI for now, as this is where all our UI for our code will be. Next, within this Codes UI, I'm going to add in a frame, which will be my background. So I'm going to rename this frame to background. Now before I continue further everyone, I would just like to say this video is going to be a bit complicated. It's not going to be really simple. There's going to be a lot of key terms you're going to have to follow. Make sure that you copy word for word perfectly, as capitalization really matters. So if you are new to programming, please bear that in mind and let's get on. Okay, so there's a couple of properties I'm going to have on my background here. I'm going to give it a nice blue color, maybe 0153255. So at this point we're just designing our UI. I'm giving you a rough idea of what your UI is going to need to look like. You can change the colours however you like, but the initial hierarchy is going to have to be pretty much the same. I'm going to leave all the border stuff to the side for now, and I'm going to change the position to 0.3120, 0.2050, so it will roughly be centre when I size this up, because I'm going to size it to 0.3750, 0.5870, which when we do that, it's pretty much center of the screen. Okay, so now within this background, we're going to add a few things. First of all, we're going to add a UI corner to round off the edges, and on this UI corner, I'm going to give it a radius of 0.08, 0, so we can get some nice rounded corners here. I'm next going to add a UI gradient, so then we can get some different shades of blue, just to make it look a bit nicer. You don't need to do all of this. As I say, design it however you like. And the colour of this sequence here, I'm going to go from a white to a darkish grey, a bit more of a grey colour, like so. And you can see by just doing that, we've kind of got a light to dark fade, and then we can change the rotation of that. I'll make that -90, and now it kind of fades down, which is quite nice. Next, I'm going to add a UI stroke just to clean the edges up a bit. Now on this stroke, I'm going to make it white. I'm going to maybe make the thickness 3. Okay, next we're going to need to add a text label into our background. This will be our header, so let's call this header. And this will simply just say codes, that's it. So I'll put the background transparency as 1. Make the position 0.199, 000. And then the size, I'm going to make 0.60, 0.1680, and I will scale this up. Scale it, make the text color white, and I'll make the text say codes, just so it looks a bit nicer. Next, we need to add our description text, so I'm going to add a text label into our background, and we'll call this description. This will be the text that says something like follow at, and then whatever your username is on Twitter for codes. So what I'm going to do is, once again, I'm going to make the background transparency 1. I'm going to set the position to 0.0440, 0.1660. Now, of course, if you're designing this your own way, you don't need to follow all my sizes. This is just a nice basis UI, which I think looks quite clean. So next, our size, I'm going to make 0.908, 0.3670. And under our text, once again, make it bold. And then I'll make this label say follow at username on Twitter for codes or something like that. Then we'll make this text white, of course, scale it, And that looks good to me. Next, what I'm going to do under here, I'm going to add a UI text size constraint, just so the size isn't huge like this. We can actually play around with it a bit. And on this size constraint, I'm just going to set the max size to 45. Okay, now we need to add a text box into our background. So let's add a text box. And this text box is where the user will input the code. So I'm going to make this, once again, blue, maybe 0145225. There we are, it's a slightly darker shade of blue. I'll make the position 0.1430, 0.5320. And I'll make the size 0.7130, 0.250. Now once again, I'll make the text bold. Let's change this text here to enter code. I'm going to make the placeholder text white. I'll make the text color white as well, and I'll scale it as well. And once again, the text is a bit big, so I might add a text constraint here. So let me add a text UI text size constraint. I'm going to constrain it at a max size of 45 again. And then I'm also going to add a UI corner in here, and this UI corner I'm going to make 0.10. Okay, and last but not least, we need our submit button to submit the code. So let me add a text button, and I'll call this submit. I'm going to change the color to 892550. That makes a nice green color. I will change the position to 0.2310, 0.8160. And I'm going to change the size to 0.536, 0.1410. Once again, I'm going to make the text bold, and I will change the text to say submit. Make it white again, but this time, because white on green, it's not the greatest contrast in the world. So I'm going to make the text stroke transparency, 0.6, just so it's not as bright. And once again, we want to scale the text. Now, I'm not really going to need to put a constraint on this text. It fits quite nicely. But what I will do is add a UI corner, which I'm going to set the corner radius to 0.250. So this looks quite nice for the UI. I quite like this. So let's actually get on to the hard stuff now. Oh, sorry, before we can get on to the hard stuff, I'm forgetting something. The most important thing, a button to open the UI. So let me just, under our codes UI, not in the background now, we're going to add a text button. I'll just call this open. I will change the color to 0.1522253. I'll change the position to 0.013, 0.4490. And I'm going to change the size to 0.10, 0.10. Next, I'll make the text bold. I will make it white. I'll make it say codes, scale it up, and I'm going to make the text transparency black and give it a text stroke transparency of 0.6. Then, last but not least, I'm going to add a UI corner with a curvature of 0.1, 0. Okay, the next thing I want to do is actually program all of this UI to kind of work. So under our codes UI, let's add a local script, and we can leave it as a local script. You can rename it to management or something if you want, but for now I'm going to leave it as a local script. Now the first thing I want to do is I'm going to create 5 variables to reference all the UI within this screen GUI. So first of all, we want to reference the UI. So local UI equals script.parent. That is literally the code's UI, everything, all referenced there. We're going to need a local background, so bg equals UI.background. So local submit is going to be bg.submit. That's our submit button, and then we need our text box, local text box equals bg.textbox. Okay, next I'm going to create a script for the open button, which will be local open equals UI.open. I can actually drag that up there, I don't know why I've made a gap there. And now we can start 2 functions. We're going to need 2 functions in this script. The first function will be called when the open button's clicked, just to display the UI. That'll be simple, 1 line of code in that function. And then we're going to need a function for when the submit button's clicked, which will be, if I think about 4 lines of code, but we're going to need to create ourselves a remote event. Not a remote event, sorry, a remote function. Okay, so let's get started. So open dot mouse button 1 click :connect function. So when the open button is clicked, we're going to call this function. we'll say bg.visible, so the background visibility is going to be equal to not bg.visible. So if visibility is false, then it will be set to true. If it's true, it will be set to false. So if we were to now hit play, you'll see we can toggle on and off our screen GUI, our codes. Alright, by default as well, I'm going to go to our background and make it visible turned off. Okay, so next we're going to need, when our submit button's clicked, a submit.mousebutton1click :connect function. So this function will be called when the submit button's clicked. First thing we want to do is turn the text editability of our text box off, meaning we can't type in the box after we've clicked submit, just so they can't change their code last minute, which could create some bugs. So to do that, we'll say textbox.textEditable equals false. Now we're going to get into more complicated stuff. So before we can do this, we're going to go under replicated storage and we need to add in a remote function. Now if you don't know what a remote function is, it basically allows us to call a function from one script in another script. It's similar to remote events, but kind of more for functions, so that's pretty much it. Okay, so let's say local message equals, and this message is going to be the text, it's going to be what we get back from the text box. So when they click submit, the text box will send us back one of three texts: invalid code, redeemed, or already redeemed. And this message is what that text is. So this message will either be already redeemed, redeemed, or code invalid, one of those three. So to do that, we're going to say game.replicateStorage. I'm going to rename this remote function to submit code. So it will be game.replicateStorage.submitCode, invoke server. And now in here we need to pass our textbox.text, because this is the code they've entered. And you'll see why we're doing this in a minute when we actually code our function, our remote function. But for now, just leave this written down and we'll come back to it in a minute and you'll have a good idea of what it's actually doing. So after this, we need to set the textbox.text equal to the message, because the user needs to know whether it's been redeemed or not. And we need to then say textbox.textEditable equals true again, because they can change it now to ready to enter another code. Okay, now I'm going to close this script for now, and we will come back to that local message shortly, I promise. In the meantime, we now need to code the actual code script. Now I'm going to create a script in server script service, and I will call this codes. Now before we start typing in here, I'm going to add inside this code script, I'm going to add a module script. It's very important, it's a module script inside of the code script, and we're going to call this codes list. Now before we start programming all our code, main code stuff, let's create our codes first. You can always add more codes in the future, but for now let's get our base codes done. So all we need to do in here is return and then angle brackets. Now I'm not going to explain module scripts too much at the minute. All you really need to know is that they kind of act as a script which other scripts can get variables and other data from. That's all I'm going to say for now. I'm not going to go too deep into it. Okay, so let's create our codes. So let's open up some square brackets and we'll call this codes. And we're going to set this equal to a table. So within this table, we're going to have all our codes. So let's call this test code 1. Test code 1 equals give cache. Oh, sorry. Test code 1 equals, and then an angle bracket for another table. So essentially what we've got is a table in a table, in kind of a table. I know this is confusing, but especially if you don't really know what you're doing, just follow along, make sure you get everything correct, all your spelling, everything. Just, of course, if you know what you're doing, you can play around a bit more, but just if you really are like, what on earth is going on right now, just keep with it and you'll understand, roughly understand what's sort of going on later. So this test code 1, this is the name of our code. So if the user types test code 1 into the code input, then they'll be rewarded a code because it's the right code. So I'm going to add another square bracket into here. I'm going to call this code type equals, And here's where you can have different types of codes. So you can have codes that give you cash, codes that give you gems, codes that give you something else. And that's why I'm doing a code type. I'm going to have one code that gives us cash, one code that gives us gems. I'm going to make this code type give cash, and then a comma, drop down, and the amount I'm going to set equal to 100. This is basically the amount of cash. In fact, I'll actually comment this. This is the amount of cash that's awarded. Okay, and that's it for our first code. Now I'm going to put a comma and do all this again, but this time I'm going to write test code 2 instead of 1. So this is my second code. Of course, call these whatever you want. You may have one code that's called like release, another code called 5k likes, something like that. Anyway, we're going to equal this, set this equal to another table with a code type will be equal to, this one's going to give me gems, so I'll call this give gems, comma, and then we'll say amount equals, I'll give us 25 gems. So this is the amount of gems awarded. And these will be my two codes. You can add as many codes as you like. Notice I don't have a comma after my last code because I'm not adding another list, another item to the table. Okay, and that's it for our codes list script. Now we need to go inside of our code script and we need to create some code. This is going to be a very complicated script to a beginner, so please bear with me. I'll break this down as easily as I can. This script can be broken down into two main parts. The first main part is handling the code. The second main part will be saving the codes, so when they leave and rejoin, it will know whether or not they've redeemed it before. In fact, the second part, the data storing, we've done videos on that before, but I'm going to show you how to implement it for our codes. But we have done a video on data stores before if you want a bit more information. So now let's focus on actually managing the codes. The first thing we want to do is create a variable for our codes list. The codes list is our module script here. Essentially, we just want to reference that. So local codes list equals require script.codes list. Now the reason we do require, sorry, I don't want two brackets there. The reason we do require is because essentially we're trying to get a codes list, we're requiring a codes list, and because the codes list is a module script, you have to require it. Whenever you're trying to access a module script, you always have to require it. Okay, next what we're going to do is call a function when the player joins the game, which will create a new codes folder, which is where we'll store our codes, whether or not they've redeemed them. Okay, and what this codes folder will do, will store the codes. So when the user enters a code and it's redeemed, we'll add the name of the code into this folder so that then we'll be able to tell whether they've redeemed it before or not. So let's start by creating this function that will be called when a player joins the game. So game.players.playerAdded connect function player. This is just a default function that's called, it's built into Roblox, so when a player joins the game, this function will be called. And we pass the player in here. In fact, I'll actually make that player rather than PLR, just for the sake of being able to see it better. Okay, now let's create our local codes folder. So this will be the new folder we're going to create. So it will be instance.new, a folder, because that's what we want to make, inside of the player. And the codes folder, we'll say codes folder.name will set equal to codes. And that's now going to, if we hit play, create a folder inside of our player called codes. We go to players and then our player, you'll see we've got a folder now called codes. Okay, next we need to create we actually need to make our submit code function. This is what's going to be complicated, but it's not that bad when you break it down. So let's say game.replicatedStorage.submitCode.onServerInvoke, because if you remember, we invoke the server in our local script. So here we say onServerInvoke equals function player and code. So what we're doing is we're simply passing in the player that we're invoking, which is by default invoked with the local script, and the code, which is of course the text that the users put in the text box. So what we're going to say now is if codes list dot codes and then open brackets code is not equal to nil, then, so what this line is saying is basically, if there are codes, or if the code is valid, is kind of what it's saying. So if this code here is valid, if it exists, which, you know, it does, so if this code exists, then, you know, then we're going to manage it. Otherwise, what we want to do is return invalid code, because if it doesn't exist, then it's invalid. It's not in our database, so the code must be invalid. So we'll return invalid code, which is already enough for us to test this. So what we do when we return it, we're setting local message to the returned value of the submit code function, which in this case should be invalid code if the code doesn't exist. So if we hit play, open up our codes, and I enter a code that doesn't exist, it should then print invalid code, which it does. So what we need to check now is if the code is nil. So basically, if the code isn't inside the player, then we need to generate it inside the player so we know whether it's been redeemed before or not. So if player.codes :find first child and the code is nil, then what we will do is we're going to create the code and put it inside the player. If it's not nil, that means it must already exist, in which case we're going to return already redeemed, because the code is already inside the player, meaning they've already redeemed it before, so we will return already redeemed. Otherwise, we'll say local temp equals instance.new, and we're going to create a bool value. It can be anything really. I'm just going to make it a bool value. We're not actually going to change the value of the boolean. We're just going to set it to the player to the name, and comma player.codes, because we want to put it inside the codes folder. Next, we'll say temp.name. I'm calling it temp. Sorry, name with a capital N. I'm calling it temp just because it's only a temporary variable that goes inside the player. Equals code. So the name of it is set to the code. So if we now hit play, you'll see if I enter test code 1 under the codes folder, you ready? It will put test code 1 inside the codes. And that's how we will know whether they've redeemed the code or not. Alright, next we're going to create some if statements to basically go based on the the code type. So, for example, if it's give cash, then we want to give cash. If it's give gems, then we want to give gems. So if codes list dot codes, and I'll make that code dot code type is equal to give cash. Of course, give cash is it needs to be spelt the exact same as it is in here. So what we're saying is if the code dot code types give cash, we're going to create a variable local money, which is the or cash, local cash, which is the amount of cash. So local cash equals, and then the amount, which will be codes list dot codes, and then we want the specific code dot amount, because that's the amount of cash that we get given. Then what we need to do is say player dot leader stats dot cash dot value plus equals cash, and then what we can do is say else if, and then copy all this code up here, but just change from give cash to give gems. Then we want to copy this code here, do the exact same thing again, but rather than cash we want to give gems. So we'll call this local gems plus equals gems, and player.leaderstats.gems, and yeah, we just want to change everything for the gems. And then once we've done that, we can return valid code, because the code worked. So if we now hit play, if we go to codes, enter some random code, you'll see invalid code. If we enter test code 1, it will give us 100 cash. It will go into our codes folder. And then if we say test code 1 again, it will say already redeemed. Now if we say test code 2, it will give us 25 gems. Perfect. Now let's make it save. So as I say, we've already done a video on data stores before, so I won't go too much in detail here, but I'm just going to show you how to do it for our codes. So let me create something down here saying data saving below or something like that. And now down here we'll say local DS for data store equals game :get service data store service :get data store, and we'll call this save data -1. If you ever want to reset data, change this to -2 or -3 or something like that. Now we'll say game.players.player added :connect function player. We're going to wait just a very short amount of time, and then we need to create a player key. So local player key equals id underscore ..player .user id. And then it's say local get saved equals ds : get async, the player key, and then if get saved, then we need to loop through each of our codes. So just say for v in pairs get saved, do local temp, because once again we're just creating a temp thing to put back into the folder, equals instance.new, and this will be a bool value. Essentially we're just doing what we did inside the player.code, sorry. We're doing what we did up here, we're just doing there, but back down here. And also temp.name equals v. That's all we're doing, we're basically recreating the code, putting it in the folder if it's saved. And then we need to put an else on this if get saved. And we need to say local values for saving equals in the table. Then for iv in pairs player.codes get children. So for every code the player has, we want to loop through it and do table.insert values for saving, v.name. Once again, as I say, I'm not going through it too much. And then after this, for loop, and so ds : get async, player key, values for saving. Now after all that, we need to say game.players.player removing, :connect function player. And then we get our local save values equals a table. Then we just do this exact same code here, this for loop. I'm just going to copy and paste that down here. And instead we're going to make that save values v.name, and then at the end we do ds : set async id underscore .plr.user id, save values. And that's it. As I say, I'm not explaining this too much because we've done a video on it before. I've kind of just created a few for loops to save our codes. So now if I hit play, nothing would have saved yet, but it will do from now on. So of course my cash and gems have saved, but that's because I've got a separate data store for them. Anyway, let's go to code. Let's say I enter some gibberish, invalid code. Test code 1, submit, valid code. Test code 2, submit, valid code. Let's try enter test code 2 again, already redeemed. Now let's close this and press play again, and it should have saved. Right, so let's open our codes, hit test code 1, already redeemed, perfect, and it's saved. And what we can do is if we ever want to add another code, we can simply go in our codes list, grab another code, put a comma, make this test code 3, and I'll make this give cash, and maybe I'll make this one give 250 cash. And all we have to do now, hit play. Once we've done that, it will be saved. So all the others will still not work. Test code 2, already redeemed, everything like that. And if I say test code 3, valid code, gives us the stuff, and if I stop and replay, it should save. So if I now type test code 3, it should say already redeemed. That's a lowercase t. Yep, already redeemed. And perfect, there you are. And that, everyone, is how to make a Twitter code system, or anything. You can then post your codes onto your Twitter or whatever, so people can see where it is. And yeah, I'm sorry, it was quite complicated, but I'm sorry about that. But I hope you found this video helpful, everyone. If you did, then you should give yourselves a pat on the back, because wow. Essentially, as I say, I created gaps in these if statements to make it look simpler. But if you don't have any gaps, your code is looking something like this, which I think you should give yourselves a pat on the back, because it's not easy code, I'll tell you that. So yeah, I hope you found this video helpful, everyone, and I'll see you in the next one, and goodbye.